Scansite here in San Rafael. We've got the pleasure of having David, one of the founders of the company, and Sloan with Results Media, and then, of course, myself, Rex. We're here today to find out a little bit about the history of Scansite. So I'm hoping, David, you could just tell us a little bit about just an overview, quick overview of Scansite.
Well, we started out in the early 1990s, and my background was in architecture, so I was doing architecture. And we found projects that needed, we were dealing with organically shaped objects, which are very difficult to draw in CAD. And of course, CAD was in a much more primitive state back then. And we came across a project for a furniture company, and they had these very organically shaped nesting tables. And these were things that, there were 8 of them, and they fitted inside of each other with a lot of, very high tolerance. And it had to be really precise. And we thought, well, how can we do this? If we make these by hand in the traditional method, they're probably not going to fit correctly. Because imagine trying to carve the same shape, an organic shape, each one maybe a 1/4 of an inch smaller, and have them fit inside of each other. Very difficult. So we hit upon the idea of 3D scanning and milling, and then just scaling each one down proportionally. It seemed like a great idea. However, 3D scanning was practically unknown then.
Who was doing 3D scanning at the time? Like
well,
what industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. There were a few 3D scanners around, and they were mostly owned by, for example, NASA had one. I think I remember the University of Michigan had one. They were entirely in the hands of private entities. So if you were an entrepreneur, for example, and you wanted to get something 3D scanned, you had nowhere to go. And we finally, fortunately for us, one of the few companies making 3D scanners was in Monterey, California. It's called Cyberware. They're now out of business. And they had, their founder, a gentleman named Lloyd Edelman, had been in the military studying optics, and he had kind of taken his knowledge from the military and built scanners, which he was then selling to the public. So the very first uses of 3D scanning, in many cases, were in filmmaking. So the very first Terminator movie, just to kind of put a date stamp on this, if you imagine the very first one with Arnold Schwarzenegger, they actually used Cyberware scanners to do some of the head and body scanning for that movie. So that's what, 1990 or thereabouts, yeah. And so I went down to Cyberware and met these people, and fortunately Lloyd and I hit it off fairly well, and they agreed to do some scanning for us. But I guess the point in all of that is they weren't really doing business with the public. They were selling scanners, and they were glad to work for ILM on something as sexy as the Terminator movie, but they weren't really in the business of having people walk in off the street and say, I'm making a new piece of furniture, and would you scan it for me? So that's kind of how it started.
So early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So did we hear about the AOL dial-up tune around then? Is that like, I'm hearing you're now a tech company that's been around since before the prevalence of the internet is what I'm hearing. Is that?
It was a long way before the internet. I can remember years later when the internet came out and people were grabbing domain names, and we grabbed the name Scansite.com, which we've always loved that name. But at the time, we thought, this is really a waste of money. This is never going to come to anything, this internet. So anyway, that kind of dates it. The computers that we used back then were, Windows existed, but it was not a serious program. It was not used for industrial applications. And the Macintosh was, I can't even remember where the Macintosh was, and it wasn't, I think it was called Apple. It was pre-Macintosh. So everything in the 3D world ran on something called Silicon Graphics, which is a now defunct company, and also the Sun Microsystems machines. And so these were Unix-based machines, And when we first got into 3D scanning, the software did not even have a graphical user interface. It was run on a command line. So one of our first challenges when we opened Scansite in the early 90s was we had to all learn Unix. We had to learn to type commands.
And did you have to use like relative? I mean, how do you do the drawing? Was it all through like code using like relative coordinates and in different ways like that? Or were you actually able to draw, or does that make sense? Just how were you able to put the input into the computer at that time?
Well, the scanners ran on a command line, and we acquired points or a point cloud, and the problem was getting that to what we call the downstream user. And CAD programs at that time were equally, just like computing, were in a pretty primitive state. If you can remember what a Mac Plus was,
Oh yeah.
it had a screen that was about 9 by 12. And so that kind of dates you to that period. I can actually remember trying to do CAD on a Mac Plus screen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think there's one right there. Actually, it's not 9 by 12. I'd say it's more like 5 by 8
Yeah.
inches. Yeah.
We got
And-
phones almost that big
Right.
today.
Yeah, it's like a tablet of some kind. The problem in the beginning, the biggest problem we had was interfacing with the downstream user. So they were using CAD, and the CAD industry at that time was pretty much owned by a company or a product called ProE. They're still around. They've been eclipsed by SolidWorks. But they were pretty much the main game in town. And so we were constantly trying to understand how to send our scan data to these people using ProE software. And these were, in many cases, engineers, aerospace, automotive people. And how to give them usable product. And it was a really big problem. The output formats back then, the basic one was IGES. But, as we went through the 1990s, I can remember constant problems of, well, we've imported this, but, the surfaces have all come apart and there are gaps in the surfaces. We need a solid. Or I remember one guy say, I imported that IGES file you sent, and it looks like a big bundle of straw. And that was more difficult than learning how to scan and how to use scanners, because if we couldn't pass it on to the downstream user in a way they could use it, then we didn't have a business. And, mercifully that worked itself out as the 90s went on, and gradually, our ability to output got better, and their ability to input and interface with us got better. And it's fantastic now.
The file sizes back then, were they, I'm thinking a correlation with cameras, digital cameras, so the camera shot is so much larger now. Is it the same thing with scanning? Is the scan that you would have done 30 years ago the size of that file?
It would be minuscule. It would be minuscule, yeah,
Minuscule.
compared to what we have now.
Got it.
And part of the reason was the computers were not powerful.
Right, just not processing it.
And, over there in our computer museum, which isn't on camera, I guess, but you see Indigo 2 and some other relics. And I can remember we bought at one point a Silicon Graphics Octane. It was the most powerful computer you could buy. I think we paid about $100,000 for it. And it had 256 megabytes of RAM.
That's
And
incredible.
we thought we were in hog heaven.
Right,
We just were the cat's pajamas. It had dual processors. So that's how far things have come. And yeah, the files were tiny, and there are many technical problems. In the beginning, we would take individual scans. Say we scanned maybe 8 angles around an object, but we weren't able to really put those together automatically. They had to be, we actually had to program the putting together of those scans. So something that's just can happen in 5 minutes now, then could be 5 days.
So was the very first scan that piece of furniture? Was that? I don't see it in the museum. That's what I'm asking. So
Actually, there are 3 of them right
Oh,
up
really?
front there. Yeah,
Okay.
they're right in front of the window.
nice.
And that was a wonderful project. It's a great company called PIL, wonderful sculptor named Miranda Leonard who started it. And they were actually one of the very first companies making furniture out of composite materials. So if you look at those pieces, you'll see graphite, Kevlar composites. I think Steve Jobs actually purchased one of their desks for himself at one point. Do you remember the Next computer?
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this was in that era. We had photo shoots of her products with the Next computer. You know, if you remember, it looked like it was graphite. It was black.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And Steve Jobs was kind of hot on it, and that was all happened in the mid-90s.
And even carbon fiber in the mid-90s was some pretty high-tech, process.
It was, and like the scanning equipment, mostly the military had it, and we were actually involved in manufacturing that furniture, and it was mostly, Hexcel and a lot of companies that said, well, we're not sure we can sell this to you, but maybe we will. We'll sell you some scraps.
So way back when, were you thinking we're just going to take over the furniture industry and do this, or were you just thinking where's the next job going to come from, or what was in your mind way back then?
Well, we thought that we could become a service bureau, a 3D scanning service bureau, which we did. And the furniture, it was a lot of fun, and we ended up going to Milan, Italy one year to the Salone Internazionale di Mobili, which is the great furniture show of the world, where the hot designers like Stark and all these people come and show their newest products. So we took a booth there one year and worked with PIL to build a 1,000 square foot booth, filled it with the furniture, the composite furniture.
Wow.
But as far as Scansite goes, we were always wanting to become a service bureau and expand. So we went after both the companies in the art world, the museum world, and we also tried to go after the industrial users. We felt it was a really fertile market because no one was doing it. We sometimes say that we were the first 3D scanning service bureau to offer services to the public. We're talking maybe 1993. I think some people would dispute that, but if we weren't the first, we were one of the first.
I do believe in companies that, whether you're exactly first or not, the fact that you were willing to pick up and run with something that was unproven, that wasn't used, and make and help that actually come to life for the rest of the world. For me, that it deserves a lot of credibility. Just, very few people are willing to see change and work towards that if it's not already developed. And so that's the one thing that I've noticed from the very beginning, is that you guys were willing to work through those challenges and become one of those leaders in it. And so in my research, I do see you guys prominent as probably the first provider in the service. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've seen in my lifetime, most high-end technology comes from space or NASA, or the like Boeing. That's where I see a lot of that kind of technology evolve. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, certainly. A lot of the things we've just been mentioning, the 3D scanning, the composite materials, was from the military. And fortunately, they allow it to leak out into the, into the public sector. It's definitely true. And to this day, so much of the research and development they're doing, comes back to us.
One of my favorite questions to ask, and you've heard me ask other people this, but I love it. What is your favorite project that you've had the pleasure of working on?
Well, my background is in architecture and art history and art. I've also studied classical painting and figure painting and so forth. So I love art, even though I deal a lot in the technology world and the world of engineering. But for many years, I would say from maybe 1998 until just a couple years ago, we did most of the work for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And we had a wonderful relationship, and I would typically go there every year in the summer, and they would have stacked up maybe 12 to 15 or 20 projects that they would want me to scan. So I would stay in New York for 2 or 3 weeks and every day go to the Metropolitan Museum, and I I had a wonderful friend
Kid in
there.
a candy store there, right?
Sorry?
Kid in a candy store.
Yeah,
right?
and Ron Street, who unfortunately has passed on, but he was the director of digital 3D applications at the Met. He's a good friend of mine. And we scanned everything. And so I got to hands-on scan, works by Michelangelo, Degas, can't really recall every one of them, but some of the major artists, and really see them close up. And it was usually, these were not things that were on display. It was down in the dark, bowels of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they have all the kind of creepy stuff. A lot of it never gets on display. And so you got to see what curators see. And I got to spend a lot of time with curators. Carmen Bombach was one person who was the head of Renaissance drawings at the Metropolitan. And she was a great friend and asset. And so that was wonderful, just seeing this art. And if you go to metmuseum.org and look at their catalog, a lot of the things in the catalog were things that we helped to create.
And what, in turn, is it more for historical preservation or more for let's shrink it down and put it in the gift shop? And also, is the Met one of the first innovative museums out there to embrace 3D scanning?
Well, that's a great question. They were. They were, I think, ahead of almost everyone else. But the purposes were manifold, and probably most of the projects ended up being used to make copies that were sold. And of course, in the museum world, there's one hard and fast rule: is you never make a copy at the same size. It's just completely forbidden. So usually they would be smaller. And however, like some of the most interesting projects were what we call one-offs, where there might be some scholarly application. And one of the most interesting of those was a project for something called the Cloisters Cross. If you know the Cloisters Museum in New York, in Upper Manhattan, their pride and joy is something called the Cloisters Cross, which is a cross made of walrus tusk. They've dated it from about the 11th century. It's a gorgeous piece. Some of the pieces of walrus tusk are about this long. It's about 24 inches tall. And we scanned that and helped them replicate it. And the intent there was that, and this comes up all the time, is a museum will have a piece that came from somewhere else. And the people, whence it came, would like a copy. Of course, they really like the original, but that's not about to happen. But they'll say, would you make us a copy? And so in this case of the Cloisters Cross, they think it was made at Bury St. Edmunds Church in England. There was a school of ivory carving then. And they're pretty sure it came from there. So that church asked the Metropolitan Museum to make them a copy. And so we did. And we scanned it, and the Ron Street and the people at the Metropolitan Museum made an exact copy. They cast it. Ivory is a tricky material because it's translucent. And if you don't get that translucency right, it doesn't look right. So after a lot of experimentation, they were able to make a translucent copy of it, and then they had to paint it and stain it with all kinds of inks and varnishes to really make it so the curator can't tell it from the original. And we did several projects like that, and then it was taken to Bury St. Edmunds with great pomp and circumstance, and the Archbishop was there, and they installed it.
So museums were calling upon you guys to do such services. Has the industry evolved to where artists themselves could reach out to Scansite and get works done, or is that just done on the fringes, or is it still kind of controlled by the museums?
Well, it's a good question, and we do a lot of work for artists. I don't know if it's 30-40% of our work, and it's very if you can look around this room, you'll see pieces of art laying everywhere. And one of the most common uses of 3D scanning is when you want to change the scale of something. So you have a piece of work, everyone loves it, it's 3 feet tall, now they want it 6 feet tall. So how do you do that? You know, in the old days, there was something called pointing. And there were whole guilds of people that were called pointers. And their whole job was to enlarge or reduce sculpture. And they had these tools. There was one ancient tool that goes back to the ancient Romans called a pantograph. And you can still, some people even still use them. And it was a bunch of rods you would connect together and put them on the object and then project them out based on the scale factor to get the dimensions of the new piece you were carving. But ultimately, the pointer had to be an artist himself, and he had to look at the original and then recarve the new one. And so no matter how good the guy was, it's going to be his own interpretation. And so that's a problem. That's traditionally been a problem for artists. With 3D scanning, you don't have that because the scanner doesn't lie, just like the camera doesn't lie. And so we can now offer to take an artist's work and create a proportionally exact copy of it. So artists love that. They think that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so a lot of our work is usually for scaling. We scan things, and it can go to either a 3D printing machine or just as often a 3D milling machine to make a new pattern, we usually call it, and that's used to make a new piece of art.
That brings up you talking about the 3D printing and 3D milling. And as a layman here, I would love for you to discuss, because the one thing that I've always seen is CAD's perfect, but it's not real life. It's perfect. So then you have, what if you took a CAD drawing of a piece that was made and manufactured, and then you scan that piece after it was made? Would there be a difference?
There are a lot of variables there, and that brings up another thing that we do a lot, which is inspection, which is just what you described. You scan something that's been made, and you compare it back to the CAD files, and you see if it was made properly. But there are a lot of variables. One is, for example, with plastic things, and so many things now are injection molded, and in art you have resin. These things typically twist when as they cure, they change shape. They also shrink. A lot of materials, the shrinkage can be as much as 1 or 2%, which is a lot. So yes, objects are typically different after they're manufactured. And with inspection, which we do a lot of that, it's usually industrial inspection in which some part doesn't fit. And a company comes to us and says, this isn't mating up with this other part. Can you tell us why? And we scan it, we compare it to their CAD file, and we have wonderful tools for very graphically showing where the errors are. They're color maps, color deviation maps. So you can say, okay, anything red is out by 1 millimeter, etc. So yeah, they're wonderful tools for doing what you described.
Is it more accurate when you send it? So let's say that you do the CAD and you got it all right. Is milling going to be accurate? So same question, but we're going to send it to a mill and then scan it. Do you think the chances of it being accurate is pretty high?
Well, there are little inaccuracies that can seep in along the way.
So even with a mill, which for me is almost like a perfect, it gets to in an area where I can't see, far better accuracy. So yeah, I would love to hear about this.
Well, mills can maintain really high levels of accuracy, but sometimes a lot of times in the art world, things are not milled 100% because it requires more and more machine time. So a lot of times they're kind of rough cut, or sometimes they say they're hogged out, which means you go over them with a large bit. And so there are areas
close, but not.
Yeah. So milling machines can be, if you're willing to pay the price and put in the machine time, they can be extremely accurate.
So this is where I was really wanting to go with this question, because I know 3D printing is just one of the technologies growing so rapidly. compared from milling, as you just now gave us a great understanding, in comparison from milling, because the way I see it is we're starting to push a lot of that data through 3D printing that we used to actually use through a milling machine or CNC.
That's true.
So what do you see in the 3D printing? How accurate can 3D printing get?
Well, it can be extremely accurate, and it generally is. I mean, it's really hard to find a 3D printer that's not accurate. But in many cases, if you want to get down to really tiny tolerances, the micron level, then those 3D printers, like everything else, are more expensive.
Right.
But they can hit really high levels of accuracy.
So 1990, could you have envisioned being able to have the tools in CAD, the tools in scanning, and send it to a 3D printer?
Well, the CAD tools and the scanning tools, they were crude, but we could see where they might improve, and they did. 3D printers, we never visualized. I didn't anyway. And the reliance we have on that now, I didn't see that coming.
You can't make a good 3D print without a good 3D file. I
Absolutely.
would assume.
Yeah. And we sometimes, when people ask us what we do, that's one of our examples, is that if you want to 3D print something, you need a 3D file. And probably the minority of them are made with 3D scanning. The most common way a 3D file is made is someone starts from scratch, in a CAD package. So any high school kid can take, any of the many 3D CAD packages out there and create widgets and all kinds of cool things that can then be 3D printed. It's not that hard.
What's the history of CAD? Was it always an auto? It was before Autodesk acquired them, correct?
Well, CAD, of course, CAD stands for computer-aided design,
Right.
which is kind of ambiguous. But it pretty much just means using a computer to draw things, and it can be 2D. Autodesk started with AutoCAD, which was 2D, and then eventually CAD became 3D.
Isn't that really what gave ProE the entrance in the door? Is AutoCAD was so deep into 2D,
Yeah.
and then ProE, I think, was a little bit more 3D modeling. I know it was a long time ago, but that's kind of the way I watched it evolve.
Yeah, well, we didn't think of AutoCAD as 3D back then. Now
Right.
it has really strong.
3D rendering.
Yeah, although it's really used more by architects and to some extent industrial designers. But it definitely, if you'd said AutoCAD in 1995, people would only be thinking of one thing, and that's drawings. Flat 2D drawings.
So you mentioned about the tusks, and I was interested in what are some of those difficult surfaces, textures to do a 3D scan, and then a follow-up question to that: what has been on top of your mind some of the most challenging projects around those surface challenges? Maybe something that was 20, 30 years ago that you could do and snap, is super easy these days, or something that's just, if it's glass or if it's a wicker or if it's water trying to seep through something, is there anything that comes to mind?
You just hit 3 really good examples.
Oh, did I? Okay, great.
Yeah, anything that's translucent or transparent, is the worst of all. Glass, we can't really scan glass. In fact, we can scan through glass. We can, with our new laser scanners, we were just the other day scanning through the windshield. We were scanning the dashboard of a car through the windshield. And it was like the windshield wasn't even there. Anytime you go to a museum, it's always a challenge because right away you cannot coat anything. And our usual solution to tricky surfaces is we coat them. And we have a whole variety of, we love, if we can, to spray things with automobile primer. That's our go-to surface, but of course it doesn't come off. So then we have different types of coatings that do come off, but they're not quite as good as auto primer. But when you go to a museum, you know right away you can't coat anything. So I would say one of the more difficult projects was the Cloisters Cross because it's ivory, and ivory's translucent. So when the scanner hits that surface, whether it's a laser or a structured light scanner, it's ambiguous where it really is. It's not just bouncing back. So that's always a challenge. We've scanned, in our museum work, one time we scanned some bronzes from the Benin province in Africa. They were shiny. They were oiled black bronze, and they were shiny. And so in many cases you can scan them, but you end up doing a massive amount of work on the scan data afterwards to try to get it ready for 3D printing.
In shiny surfaces, they're not good for scanning.
They're very difficult for white light scanners, of which we have several, but the newer generation of laser scanners, like we just bought the Creaform suite of scanners, they can do really well with shiny things. We just scanned a chrome motorcycle recently without any coating, and the scan was very good.
Are scanning cameras, if I think like where are they manufactured? Does the U.S. have a strong presence in that? Is it done overseas? When I say done, is the camera itself, those companies based overseas? Where are some of the bigger camera manufacturers these days? Has it changed over 30 years? Is there obviously companies around now that aren't then, or I'm just kind of fascinated about the camera side of things. If that's a burgeoning area, or companies that have developed different camera technologies over time, or what's that space like?
Well, originally, and to this day, really, the German companies have the lock on the white light scanner markets. And that would be GAM, Atos, and Breukman. Some of these companies have been gobbled up by other companies. Steinbichler, all German. And, the Germans traditionally had this edge in the world of optics, the Japanese also had very fine cameras, of course. But I think that enabled the Germans to get the jump on the 3D scanning market from the early 90s. And so those companies, I'm not exactly sure who manufactures the components of their cameras.
Right, I was thinking more of the companies themselves, if they're based. German makes sense. They make some good cars. And
they come from Germany, so I'm guessing. I know some of the video cameras on one scanner definitely are German. The new Creaform products, it's very interesting because that product, which is a wonderful, amazing machine, actually we have several of them, they're made in Canada. Now, who thinks of Canada as being a big competitor in the technology market?
Yeah,
right.
They're manufactured there, the programming is done there, and they're really on a roll. They're taking over an increasingly large segment of the 3D scanning world.
And what would a high-end 3D scanning for whatever type of job you're looking for, what kind of price range are we talking about? What are you going to spend easily north of $200,000 on a camera? Is it more like $50,000? Is there everything in between?
You mean for a scanner?
Correct.
Well, the really top of the line white light scanners like the GAM Atos, $300,000. And then that doesn't include, their photogrammetry systems that come with it and a lot of accessories that can get the price up another $100,000.
I would love to ask this because even the price tag high, it's expensive, but isn't there even a lot more to it? You scan something and you bring it into a CAD program. At that moment, how challenging it is it? And this is where what I've heard, and this is why I'm asking the questions, is where I've really seen the differentiation between Scansite 3D and just being able to go scan things. That you're able to actually do some edit. It's really is where I see it. And I think in most kinds of art and everything, it's what happens behind the scenes, not just the scanner scanning it and it going into CAD. That's great. It's wonderful. But then how challenging is it to actually make that scan effective in our world today?
Well, I always think that scanning is the easy part. And a lot of times when I finish scanning something, I'm thinking, okay, now we have the hard work ahead of us. Most scanning projects, there's a big fork in the road between whether they are used, if what we call polygon mesh is used, so that would be 3D printing, a lot of milling, or if it's being made into CAD. And right after we scan something, it kind of goes in one of those two directions. And that depends on what kind of software we use to process it. But the main point I think there is that what comes out of a 3D scanner, which we call raw data, is not really usable. I mean, in a rare case, you might get 100% data capture on something so that you could at least 3D print it. But in almost every case, there's, if it's something that's going to 3D printing, we have to make it watertight. That means we edit it so that missing data, you have to fill in every hole. Watertight means no holes. Almost all art has some kind of undercut or some area where the scanner can't see. So we have to fill those areas. And we don't just there are tools that'll let you just autofill them. But we think that's cheating. So we go in and we have tools that can, make sure that the fill is pretty close to what was there originally. So that's pretty labor intensive. And then the CAD world, if it goes that way, that's even much more labor intensive. In that case, you bring the scan data into a CAD, not actually into the CAD package, because CAD programs like SolidWorks, ProE, CATIA, they can't read scan data. That's a really important point that we have to, a lot of our clients, when they hear that, they're shocked, and we have to go through a learning curve with them. But none of these programs, they can import scan data, and you can look at it, and you can even take measurements off of it and do a few things with it, but they can't really work on it. It's not really ready for their use, and it's almost of no use to them. So in order to make it useful, we have to turn it into CAD. And there's another point of information there which most people don't realize, but there's no save as. And a lot of people, in the beginning will say, well, can't you just save the scan data as a CAD file so that I can use it? And the answer is no. Sadly, that is kind of the holy grail. There have been many companies in this industry have been trying to figure out a way to make that happen. But as far as I can tell, they're nowhere closer to it than they were 10 years ago.
That's why, in me having some information on it, that is really why I feel very confident and I can sit here and say that you guys have earned that first to market in this industry, providing this service. And that's why, is because somebody that started it 10 years ago isn't that much farther ahead. It's really what makes Scansite 3D, to what I can see, is that experience right here that we just talked about. That's what really the clients don't see.
If they are using CAD, we produce this CAD file, and this is really perhaps the aspect of our business that I'm most proud of, is the way that we can produce a really high quality CAD file that they can use, because if it's not properly done, they have trouble using it. And one service that we offer is that most CAD files can be output into a generic format, which for the CAD world is something called STEP, or there's also one called IGES. STEP is kind of becoming dominant these days for most purposes. But if you think of the main CAD packages, and there are perhaps 6 or 7, SolidWorks dominates the field. Probably, in our experience, they have more of the business than everyone else combined. But you also have, Pro Engineer Creo. You have a German company called Siemens NX. You have CATIA, French, part of the Dassault Aerospace Group in France. And there are others there's something called Solid Edge, another fine software package. But each of those programs has what they call their parametric format. And so if we give people the generic STEP format, which is called STEP, they can import it, but it doesn't have what we call a feature tree, a complete feature tree. So if they want to make alterations to it, which is very commonly what they're doing, it's not quite as easy for them. They have to go through some steps to make it usable. But one thing we can offer is we can give customers what we call a natively parametric file. So that means we can start with scan data and we bring it into our CAD creation software, which for us is a wonderful program called Geomagic Design X. That's almost all of our CAD is CAD creation from scan data is 100% done in Design X at Scansite 3D. It's very expensive software with a really big learning curve, but it's fabulous.
So I've been thinking, with this technology is just like leaps and bounds in this area, and I can see some companies out there, even perhaps some individuals that's starting a project, saying, I can do 3D scanning, I saw it on the internet. It's just, hold it there and move it, and it's 2019. I can do this myself. The internet said I could do it. How many people come through your door or call you up saying, we thought we could do it. We're stuck now.
Yeah.
Can you save us? Can you help us out? we can't figure this out. Do you have a significant amount of clients that come to you in that vein?
Absolutely. And mercifully, I'm in the technology area, so I'm not usually answering the phone. But for others who do, we hear that a lot. And you also hear, I saw it on the History Channel. That's one of our favorite refrains. That a lot of people are hyping, especially 3D printing. And now
I was going to ask you how much that's effective.
Oh yeah, and I see things in the paper. It says they're 3D printing houses now, right. And it's wonderful that they're getting it out to the public and awakening people's interest in the possibilities. That's all good, but they also make it seem too easy, and they make it seem like it's a solution to all problems, and it's cheap, and none of that is true. So we have to re-educate them, and we get it done.
You were in it long before the prevalence of 3D printing. And 3D printing because it's a physical thing and people can see it printing, I would imagine, is one of the areas that helps bring it to the forefront. But it has really risen in the public's eye. Most people know what a 3D printer is. Maybe not be able to articulate what it can and can't do, but they've seen some sort of at an event, a conference. I mean, we see them everywhere.
You do.
Notre Dame, the roof at Notre Dame.
Burned
down.
Down. How much has that changed your Scansite's business?
Well, I would say far more people know what a 3D printer is than a 3D scanner.
Right, right.
It's not even close. So, everyone is aware of it, even just your layperson. They see it everywhere.
But is that helping make the scanning world more prevalent? Is that going to help drag up the scan? So even if it's not as known by the public, for obvious reasons that 3D printing has advantage over, but still I would think that the technologies tie together so closely that the ability to 3D print is going to grow the demand of industrial or true 3D scanning.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. But keep in mind, I don't know what percentage of things that are 3D printed are created using 3D scanning, but I'd be surprised if it was even 5%. So, because it's a harder way, it's the only way to get there in some cases, but it's also a more difficult and expensive way to get a 3D file, usually. I'm probably most amazed by the tools that enable you to create really clean, simplified, beautiful surfaces from scan data. I'm always amazed whenever I use that software. It's DesignX. Here's one for Geomagic DesignX software. Fantastic.
If you're in need out there, you're a project manager, you're an engineer, you're a designer, and you're stuck, how does one get a hold of Scansite 3D?
Well, Scansite.com is our website.
Okay.
You'll find us. And there's a lot of information on the website. You can get a pretty good idea of what we do if you spend a little time with it. We have a contact form where you can send us a picture of your object with a little bit of text about what you're trying to do. We get most of our inquiries probably come that way.
Okay.
And we'll call you right back. And, we've seen, after 25 years, we've seen just about everything. So people send us, whether it's a sculpture or, a wing on an airplane, we go, oh, one of those. And we know about what it's going to cost and how to get it done.
And your passport's up to date? You can go international? You've done projects all over? Okay. We
love going internationally, and it's a little bit difficult to take. Getting through customs with a couple $100,000 worth of equipment's always an adventure, but we love traveling,
It'd be one thing if you had a couple Pelican suitcases full of all kinds of actual cameras and video. But a scanner, I could just see the people at the airport going, what are you bringing?
Well, you tell them it's a camera.
That makes sense.
And they go, oh, it's a camera, okay.
Right.
You never say scanner. And if you say laser scanner, you've made a terrible mistake. Because I had one guy say, well, he heard laser, and he said, well, could it burn a hole in the aircraft? Because I used to carry on the scan head, which is the most fragile and valuable part of the scanner. I would always carry it on. So they would look at it, and they would swab it with those things looking for explosive dust, and it was always a problem. And then I just said it was a camera, and life got much easier.
Well, man, I thank you for your time, and
My pleasure.
looking forward to having you again.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it.
You're much welcome.